This is a video presentation of Bible 2114, Unit 20, entitled Life in Palestine in the First Century. Your lecturer is Dr. Jerry Horner. The behavioral objectives for this unit are: 1. To locate the political divisions of Palestine during the ministry of Jesus. 2. To describe the social and economic conditions of first century Palestine. 3. To relate the major political developments in Palestine during New Testament times. 4. To discuss the importance of the temple and the synagogue in the life of the Jew. 5. To name the chief religious parties in Palestine during the New Testament period and to summarize the beliefs of each. 6. To list in chronological order the Jewish feasts and tell the significance of each. First century Palestine was a tiny country of unbelievably small dimensions. Its importance in world history is completely out of all proportion to its size. In New Testament times, Palestine was divided into 5 distinct political regions. Judea, the Judah of the Old Testament, was the most important, since it was always regarded as the heart of the Hebrew nation. Within its borders was Jerusalem, the holy city, always the center of national and religious life. Here was the temple, and here were centered all the religious traditions and practices of Judaism. Judea was the southern section of the territory west of the Jordan. Just north of Judea was Samaria, the home of the Samaritans, the people whose origin went back to the fall of Israel in 722 BC. This sect was a distinct religious group with a system of worship somewhat like that of the Old Testament people. There was very bitter feeling between the Jews and the Samaritans, since every Jew regarded a Samaritan as a half-breed. This racial animosity was of long standing and was very pronounced in New Testament times. Galilee was the northernmost section of Palestine and was a very fertile region. It was here that Jesus spent his boyhood and young manhood, and fully half of his public ministry was spent among the Galilean people. The region of Perea lay east of the Jordan, opposite the territory of the Samaritans. While separated from western Palestine by only a little stream, in reality it was quite a different country, since it was affected by Gentile influences much more than the western half of Palestine. Its length was approximately 40 miles, while in width it varied from 20 to 30 miles. The region immediately north of Perea and east of the Lake of Galilee was known as the Decapolis, or 10 cities. It was a sort of confederation of 10 Greek cities banded together for mutual protection. The inhabitants were Gentiles and maintained their pagan character and customs. Thus, they were usually scorned by the Jews. According to the terms of Herod's last will, 3 of his sons were to share his kingdom. Archelaus was supposed to become king of Judea, but Augustus gave him only the title ethnarch. Archelaus was a reckless despot, thoroughly hated by his subjects, and they finally secured his ouster and exile in AD 6. The fears of Joseph and Mary, which led them to settle out of the domains of Archelaus, as described in Matthew 2:22, were thus not without foundation. From AD 6 until 42, Judea was ruled by procurators, who were directly responsible to the emperor. The most important procurator, the 5th in the series, was Pontius Pilate, who governed from 26 to 36. For a brief period from the years 41 to 44, Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, ruled Judea with the title of king. This man's atrocities are described in Acts chapter 12. After Herod Agrippa's death, Judea again was ruled by procurators until the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans. Two of the later procurators, Felix, who ruled from 51 to 58, and Festus, who governed from 58 to 62, are of special interest to us because of their connection with the Apostle Paul. Herod Antipas was made Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea and served from 4 BC to AD 39. Most of the life of Jesus was spent in the territory of Herod Antipas, who, while an able ruler, was without morals or mercy. He was responsible for the death of John the Baptist. Because Herod was so sly, crafty, and vindictive, Jesus referred to him as that fox in Luke 13:32. Since he was by religion a Jew, he was present at Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover when Pilate sent Jesus to him for trial, as described in Luke 23:7. Philip, Tetrarch of Trachonitis and Iturea, was yet another son of Herod the Great, and the best of them all as ruler. He ruled from BC 4 to AD 34. Jesus was in his territory when at Bethsaida and at Caesarea Philippi. Let us give attention to the economic and social conditions of Palestine in New Testament times. The masses were extremely poor. Most of the people depended on the soil for a living, and the lack of tillable land, fertility, and dependability of rainfall kept them in economic destitution. In addition, Herod's building operation, taxes levied by Rome, and religious revenues for the temple, priesthood, and synagogue all contributed to the poverty of the people. Grapes, sheep, fruit, and grain were raised for home use and exports. Fishing was another source of food and income. Slaves were used by owners of large estates, but slavery was on the decrease. Since most farms and industries were small, hired labor was not much in demand. The average wage was 1 denarius, or about 20 cents a day. Not many of the Jews in Palestine engaged in commerce, since the scribes had drawn up rigid laws regulating contact with foreigners. Exports were chiefly agricultural products, salt, and fish. Imports consisted mainly of luxury items. While wealthy men owned large stone houses, elaborately furnished and ornately decorated, the common people were poor and lived humbly. Their houses were simple structures, often with only one large room where all the family ate, slept, and lived. These houses were built with flat roofs, which served like our porches as a place for visiting and sleeping. Their furniture consisted mainly of a few cooking utensils and dishes, small mats which served as beds, perhaps a few chairs, and occasionally a table. Rigidly fixed customs governed betrothal and marriage. Although divorce and infidelity were not as common among the Jews as among the heathen, the woman was still regarded as the husband's property and enjoyed few legal rights. Girls were not given the same educational opportunities as the boys. A joyous celebration attended the birth of a boy, but disappointed silence the birth of a girl. Occasionally, Jews would utter a ritualistic prayer in which they thanked God that they were not born a Gentile, a slave, or a woman. 40 days after the birth of a boy, or 80 days after the birth of a girl, the mother was required to bring a stipulated offering for her purification. On the 8th day, the male child was circumcised and named. Since the Jews had no surnames, the name of the father, occupation, or city followed the given name to provide identification. For instance, Joseph of Arimathea. Jewish fathers were required to teach their sons a trade. Manual labor was highly respected among the Jews, and even the rabbis worked at a trade. In Palestine, Aramaic was the language commonly spoken by the Jews. It was closely related to the Hebrew in which most of the Old Testament was composed, and which was still spoken by the rabbis and used in part of the synagogue service. Although Latin was the official language of the Roman government, Greek was the tongue usually employed by the Gentiles and was more or less familiar to the Palestinian Jews. The temple in Jerusalem was the crown and glory of Israel, not merely of Jerusalem. Situated on Mount Moriah, it dominated the city. Actually, the Jews had had 3 temples. The first one, erected by Solomon, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. After the exile, the temple was rebuilt and was dedicated in 516 BC. Herod the Great, hoping to win the favor of the Jews, erected the 3rd temple, which was not finally completed until 5 years before Titus destroyed it in AD 65. The temple which stood in the 1st century was an impressive one, both in size and in beauty. An area of some 26 acres was surrounded by a great wall and supported by an immense foundation of masonry. As a worshiper entered through one of the massive gates in this wall, he would pass through a series of courts, the inner one surrounded by the outer one, and each a few steps higher than the one surrounding it. The outer court was called the Court of the Gentiles. Here were located stalls for the sheep and doves and the money changers for the convenience of the Jews of the dispersion. A high wall excluded Gentiles from closer approach to the inner shrine. The Jewish worshiper could pass through one of the 9 gates in the wall and enter into the court of the women, beyond which the women could not proceed. Any adult male Israelite who was ritually purified could enter into the court of Israel. Beyond this was the court of the priests, containing the altar of burnt offering and huge laver. Behind the altar was the temple itself, consisting of a vestibule, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. This sanctuary was between 100 and 150 feet in height, with marble walls and a roof covered with gold. In the sanctuary the priest ministered daily. Besides the regular morning and evening sacrifices, there were continual offerings of various kinds brought by individuals. The expenses of the temple were met in part by a tax of a half shekel, levied upon all male Jews 20 years old or above. These taxes were supplemented by personal gifts, often in large amounts, by the wealthy, so that the temple treasury was a storehouse of gold and silver. The religious and social life of the Jews centered in this wonderful temple with all its glory. They felt that the very presence of God was over the mercy seat. The high priest alone was allowed to enter the Holy of Holies, and that only once a year. One of the great institutions of Judaism was the synagogue, which arose during the exile in Babylon when the people were deprived of the worship in the temple. It was both a school of the Bible and a place of worship. Wherever 10 adult male Jews were living in a town, a synagogue might be formed. These synagogues were very numerous in the 1st century. Jerusalem is said to have had as many as 480 synagogues before its destruction in AD 70. Over 150 cities of the Roman Empire are known to have had synagogues in the 1st century, and probably there were many more. The synagogues of the dispersion attracted large numbers of proselytes and still larger numbers of God-fearers. These were men who observed the Jewish food laws and attended the synagogue meetings, but shrank from the final step of circumcision. While the temple was controlled by the priest, the synagogues were controlled by laymen. A ruler had charge of the regular services in the building. An attendant had charge of the scrolls, the care of the building, and other routine matters. Services were held on the Sabbath and once or twice on weekdays. These synagogues were not only places of worship, but also centers of instruction. The Jews gave much attention to the religious education of their children. It was in the synagogue school that the young Jewish boy memorized the sacred scriptures and learned their meaning. In New Testament times, there were 6 great feasts observed annually by the Jews. Following our calendar in chronological order, these were Purim, Passover, Pentecost, Day of Atonement, Tabernacle, and Dedication. Purim was observed about the 1st of March. This observance originated with the deliverance of the Jews from the evil designs of Haman, as told in the book of Esther. Usually it was a gay occasion, observed in holiday spirit. The book of Esther was always read during the observance. The Passover, the oldest of the feasts, occurred near the 1st of April, corresponding to our Easter, and of course varied each year with the coming of the full moon. This feast commemorated the deliverance from Egypt, and was the great festival of the year, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, following for a week after the offering of the Paschal Lamb. All Jews who could came to Jerusalem then, often many hundreds of thousands. Pentecost, the Feast of First Fruits, came 50 days after the Passover. The word Pentecost means 50th. Sometimes it was referred to as the Feast of Weeks, because it came a week of weeks after the Sabbath following Passover. Pentecost was the time of grain harvest, and one ceremony connected with this observance was the presentation of the 2 wave loaves made from new wheat flour. After the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the rabbis treated this feast as the commemoration of the law-giving at Sinai, which they believed took place 50 days after the departure from Egypt. The Day of Atonement, which was actually a fast, took place in late September or early October. This was the most solemn day of the year for the Jews, the crown of the Levitical system, when the high priest made his annual entrance into the Holy of Holies. The ritual is described in Leviticus chapter 16. In Romans 3:25, Paul indicates that the death of Christ is the antitype of the sacrifice of the Day of Atonement. The contrast is elaborated in Hebrews chapter 9. The Feast of Tabernacles came 5 days after the Day of Atonement. It was a sort of thanksgiving for the blessings of the year, with special reference to the blessings of God upon their fathers in the wilderness wanderings en route to Canaan after their deliverance from Egypt. Sometimes this feast is called the Feast of Booths, because for a week the people lived in temporary shelters, reminding them that their forefathers had no permanent home during the wilderness wanderings. The Feast of Dedication came in December and was held in commemoration of the dedicating of the temple after the victories of Judas Maccabeus in December 165 BC. This feast was also called the Feast of Lights, because each evening of the week more and more lights were lit in the temple. There were 2 very influential religious parties among the Jews, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were more numerous and powerful, since they had in their party the representative religious leaders. The Pharisees originated when there was a concentrated effort to force Hellenism upon the Jews. They violently opposed Hellenism and passionately defended traditional Judaism. As a result, they were conservative in their theology and legalistic in the practice of their religion, placing more emphasis on the external and the ceremonial to the neglect of the inward and spiritual. Their very name, which means the separated one, indicates the nature of their emphasis. They were patriotic, fervent in their faith, and totally unsympathetic toward any who held different views. To them, there was no good outside Phariseeism. The Pharisees believed in the authority of the oral law, and since this belief was fundamental to their doctrine and practice, it necessitates a detailed explanation. The Pharisees held that the Old Testament law was divine, and that in it God had said His last word, and that therefore everything must be in it. God had foreseen the needs of His people, and He had met those needs in the law. If a thing was not in the law explicitly, it must be there implicitly. So the Pharisees saw it as their task to render explicit what was implicit in the law. They argued that out of the law it must be possible to deduce a rule and a regulation for every possible man in every possible situation of life. The result was thousands upon thousands of rules and regulations which are found nowhere in Scripture, but which were regarded as equal in authority. For instance, the Old Testament law lays it down that the Sabbath day is to be kept holy, and that on it no work is to be done. But the question arose, what is work? All kinds of things were classified as work. For instance, work is to carry a burden. But the next question would be, what is a burden? Listen to the Pharisaic answer. A burden is food equal in weight to a dried fig, enough wine for mixing in a goblet, milk enough for one swallow, honey enough to put upon a wound, oil enough to anoint a small member, water enough to moisten an eye salve, paper enough to write a customs house notice upon, ink enough to write 2 letters of the alphabet, reed enough to make a pen, and so on endlessly. They spent hours upon hours arguing whether a man could or could not lift a lamp from one place to another on the Sabbath, whether a tailor committed a sin if he went out with a needle in his robe, whether a woman could wear a brooch or false hair, or if a man might go out on the Sabbath with artificial teeth or an artificial limb, or even if a man might lift his child on the Sabbath day. To the Pharisees, these things were the essence of religion. Their religion was a legalism of petty rules and regulations. To heal was to work on the Sabbath. Now, obviously, healing has to be defined. Healing was allowed when there was danger to life, and especially in troubles of the eye, ear, nose, and throat. But even then, steps could be taken only to keep the patient from becoming worse. Nothing could be done to make him get any better. So a plain bandage might be put on a wound, but no ointment. Plain wadding might be put into a sore ear, but no medicated wadding. That might make the ear feel better. A woman could not look into the mirror on the Sabbath. She might see a gray hair and be tempted to pluck it out. That would be work. One could not light a fire on the Sabbath. Hence, he could not cook a meal. A person could not tie or untie a knot on the Sabbath. The Pharisees decreed that a person could only walk a certain distance on the Sabbath, and little more than half a mile. The Pharisees regarded these minute rules and regulations as literally matters of life and death and eternal destiny. This oral law was the tradition of the elders which Christ, in Mark chapter 7, accused the Jews of putting in the place of the Old Testament. They covered up the Word of God with their comments about it. Finally, they regarded the comment as of more value than the text itself. The Pharisees had other definite doctrines which they enthusiastically proclaimed. They stressed special divine providence, though they did not deny free will. They believed in the future life, the resurrection of the elect of Israel, and the existence of angels. The Pharisees were the principal opponents of Jesus during his public ministry. He condemned both their teaching and their hypocrisy. Nowadays, there is a tendency to whitewash the Pharisees. Some of them undoubtedly were holy men with high moral ideals, and many of their sayings are memorable. However, their burdensome rules and regulations tended to weaken the force of the moral requirements. While the Pharisees arose from the group opposing Hellenism, the Sadducees came from the group that readily embraced Greco-Roman culture. These theological opponents of the Pharisees are thought to have acquired their name from Zadok, a high priest invested by Solomon, whose descendants functioned as high priest until the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. The Sadducees were small in number, but formed the aristocratic priestly group and were very influential. Their theology was largely liberal and negative. They were in reality skeptical and cold-hearted, wanted to live a life of self-indulgence and luxury, and did not concern themselves with annoying details of religious duties. Theologically, they disagreed with the Pharisees on the following points. First, whereas the Pharisees accepted both Scripture and the Sadducees regarded Scripture as the only source of revelation. Incidentally, the Sadducees accepted as authoritative only the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Second, the Sadducees denied the resurrection of the body. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, they held that the soul perishes with the body. The resurrection of Lazarus was therefore a great embarrassment to the Sanhedrin. The only recorded encounter between Jesus and the Sadducees during the public ministry was a debate concerning resurrection. Matthew chapter 22. In Acts chapter 23, we read that Paul was able to split the Sanhedrin by claiming that he was on trial for defending the resurrection of the dead. 3. The Sadducees rejected the existence of angels and spirits. 4. In regard to divine providence and human freedom, the Pharisees emphasized God's control over human affairs. The Sadducees emphasized man's freedom. 5. The Sadducees applied literally the lex talionis, that is, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The Pharisees were less rigorous in imposing punishment. The ascendancy of the Sadducees ended with the destruction of the temple in AD 70. After this, the Pharisees enjoyed unchallenged preeminence in Judaism. The scribes, called lawyers and doctors of the law in the New Testament, arose during the exile. These officials, usually Pharisees, exercised a tremendous influence in the time of Jesus. Originally, as the name indicates, they were the copyists of the sacred writings. Gradually, their function changed, and they were regarded as the authoritative interpreters and teachers of the Scriptures. They claimed to have great reverence for the Old Testament writings, even counting every word in them. They gradually became a dry ecclesiastical and scholastic class, chiefly with the letter of the law. Under their influence, knowledge of the law came to be thought of as not merely a means to piety, but piety itself. It was the scribes who molded the life of the Jews. The Essenes are described by Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder, but are not mentioned in the New Testament. They were a monastic community, practicing celibacy and holding their property in common. They had a settlement in the wilderness area near the Dead Sea. The Essenes were exact observers of the law, and were Pharisees gone to extremes. For instance, they observed the Sabbath so strictly that they refrained from easing their bowels on that day. The Essenes are of interest in biblical scholarship because they secreted the manuscripts now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. When the Jews revolted against Rome in AD 66, the Essenes sealed up their scrolls in earthenware jars and hid them in caves in the sandhills above the monastery, hoping to recover them after the war. Some of them remained there until 1947, when a Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone in one of the caves and heard the smash of earthenware. When he went inside to investigate, he made the first find of the famous scrolls. Since then, several other finds have been made in the same neighborhood. The Zealots were more of a political group, having as its aim the breaking of the bonds of Roman dominion and the bringing about of Jewish independence. The Zealots were fierce patriots, had an intense messianic spirit, and were characterized by a spirit of fanaticism. Religion was of secondary interest to the Herodians, since they were politically minded. They favored a perpetuation of the dynasty of Herod. The Herodians aligned themselves with the Pharisees in opposing Jesus, since they feared that the popularity of Jesus would launch a nationalistic movement that would interfere with their plans. After their conquest, the Romans allowed the Jews to preserve some of their institutions, so long as they did not challenge Roman authority. Thus, the Jews had their Sanhedrin, or Supreme Court. Its jurisdiction, however, limited mainly to matters of religion. Civil cases of a more serious nature were handled by the Roman court. For this reason, the Sanhedrin could try Jesus on religious charges, but his civil trial and the pronouncement of the death penalty must be by Roman officials. The Sanhedrin was composed of 71 members, made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees. The members were chief priests and scribes and were called elders. The high priest was frequently only the puppet of Rome, appointed and deposed at the pleasure of the Roman ruler. This brief survey has shown that life in first century Palestine was far from ideal. Politically, there was seething unrest. The people chafed under the iron hand of Rome. Economically, the land was destitute, mainly because of its overpopulation, high taxation, and cheap labor. Religion was a hollow mockery, characterized by external appearances in which observance of petty rules was emphasized, the exclusion of love to God and to men. It was time for a change. This has been a video presentation of Bible 2114. This is the tape.